If you're poor in America, or you're a minority, and you need help, where are you most likely to get it? From government, I'm told. That's what I was taught in college, and around here, it's what most people think. Should America have a minimum wage?
Definitely. I think so.
Well, of course there should be a minimum wage.
Should there be affirmative action?
Yes, it should definitely be affirmative action.
Should there be a social safety net, welfare, food stamps?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think government aid is helpful for the poor and the minorities.
Government helps.
Yes, government definitely does help.
That's what most people believe, that without government, without things like affirmative action, welfare, the minimum wage, life for black Americans would be much worse. But is that true? No, it's not, says economist Walter Williams.
They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. This might be that road.
That bewilders Congressman Charlie Rangel.
If he's nearly as good as obviously you think he is, I'm taking him to Washington with me.
Oh, I wish he would, but he won't, because Walter Williams says government help hurts minorities. How can that be? Well, that's our show tonight. It is intuitive to think government programs lift minorities out of poverty. When President Johnson declared a war on poverty, he said, compassionate government can conquer poverty. Sounds good. Made sense to me at the time. But since then, government has spent trillions of dollars on poverty programs, your dollars, and how's that working out for us? The poverty level didn't go down. It's been stuck at about 12% of the population for 40 years. Why? Well, one reason is that government handouts encourage people to stay dependent. There's money in it. We would have known this 25 years ago had policymakers bothered to read a book titled The State Against Blacks. The author, an obscure economist, said poverty programs destroy the natural mechanisms that have always allowed poor people to lift themselves out of poverty. Public TV then ran a program based on the book called Good Intentions.
1963, a time of incredible optimism for black people. The civil rights movement was about to achieve its greatest triumphs. Federal and state governments poured immense energy and well over $1 trillion into the task of relieving poverty and promoting equality. The result, a complete failure. For many blacks at the lower end of the economic spectrum, the future looks more hopeless today than it did 20 years ago.
More hopeless today after trillions of your dollars in poverty programs? How can that be? Well, let's ask the man who said it 25 years ago, economist Walter Williams at George Mason University. So for the people at the bottom, it's just natural to assume that a handout would help lift them up.
Well, that's a nice assumption to make, but it didn't turn out that way. There's a huge segment of the black population for whom upward mobility is elusive. And I believe it's elusive because of the welfare state. It's because of government.
Because of the help meant for them. And you have written a new book that touches on this, titled Race and Economics. Mm-hmm. And one of the points you make in this book is that the minimum wage, which overwhelmingly Americans support, mm-hmm. you say hurts people.
Yes, and if you, well, look, let's not look at the intentions behind the minimum wage, because for the most part, the intentions, at least in the United States, are very good. But we have to ask, what are the effects of the minimum wage? And you find out the effects of the minimum wage if you put yourself in the place of an employer, and you must pay $7.25 no matter whom you hire. Will that employer pay that amount and hire a person who makes who can only add $3 or $4 worth of value per hour? That is, the minimum wage discriminates against the employment of low-skilled people.
So fewer of them get hired.
That is absolutely right. And to get their feet on the bottom rung of the economic ladder, be employed, and perhaps then move up.
And yet when I talk to people about this, normal people, not economists, almost everyone's is essential.
I think a minimum wage is necessary just to keep from exploiting workers.
Of course.
Why?
Because people need money these days.
People always need money. And 25 years ago, Walter Williams' documentary featured shop owners like this man who said he hires fewer people because of the minimum wage.
I wish I could give more kids jobs, because I have kids constantly coming up to me asking me for jobs, you know, and I can't give them the jobs that I would that I wish I could give. If there were a lower minimum wage, I could hire maybe 2 or 3 more.
I used to work in a store like this. I broke out of the North Philadelphia ghetto nearly 30 years ago, and so did most of my friends. My whole crowd worked. Back in those days, just about any kid who looked for a job could find one. Today, in ghettos like I grew up in, 70% of black children who look for jobs cannot find them.
And today, that number is still about the same, and the disparity between whites and blacks, white males, teenagers, 16 to 19, 27% unemployment, black males, same age, almost twice as many, more than half, 52%. Why would there be a racial difference? Well, I mean, the minimum wage, you'd think would hurt all teenagers.
Well, as I said, the minimum wage tends to discriminate against low-skilled people. So young people in general, they're low-skilled because they lack maturity and experience of adults. But black young people not only share those handicaps in general, but many of them get a fraudulent education in the public school system. So if there's a law that discriminates against low-skilled people, it's going to have a doubly negative effect on black teenagers. And by the way, John, at one time in the 40s, black teenage unemployment was less than white teenage unemployment. And today it is some multiple of it.
And it's changed because of the welfare state?
It's changed because of the minimum wage law. That is, the minimum wage law rose, got higher and higher and higher, and employers discriminated more in terms of hiring low-skilled workers.
And yet, 83% of Americans, according to a Pew survey, support raising the minimum wage.
I think people have the misguided notion that the minimum wage is an anti-poverty tool, but that doesn't even pass the smell test, because if the minimum wage law could eliminate poverty, you just go to Bangladesh, you go to Ethiopia, you go to Haiti and say, raise the minimum wage there, and you'll get rid of poverty. No, people are poor because, for the most part, they have low skills.
If you could do it with the minimum wage, why $7.25? It's sort of cheap. We should raise it to $20 an hour or $100.
Or 50.
Economists understand this. A survey of the American Economic Association found 90% of economists say minimum wage increases unemployment. And you've called it a great tool of racism.
Yeah. And matter of fact, some years ago, I wrote a book called South Africa's War Against Capitalism. And I did a study of labor markets in South Africa. And white racist unions in South Africa that would never have a black as a member were the major supporters of minimum wage laws for blacks. And their stated purpose was to protect white workers from having to compete with low-skilled, low-wage black workers.
Let's now talk about welfare. Again, when I talk to people on the street, most everyone said there ought to be government handouts for needy people. People
Definitely.
need the help?
Yes, of course, especially in this economy.
But 25 years ago, Walter Williams pointed out, government handouts encourage people not to try.
They may never learn to pull themselves out of poverty one step at a time. Like some giant drug pusher, their government has lured them into dependency on a system that will maintain them in permanent poverty. In every respect, welfare has backfired.
Government's like a giant drug pusher?
Oh, that's absolutely right. The state has done to black Americans what slavery could not have done, the harshest Jim Crow laws and racism could not have done, namely, break up the black family. That is, today, generally over 30% of black kids live in families. Historically, from 1870s on up to about 1940s, and depending on the city, 75 to 90% of black kids live in two-parent families. Illegitimacy rate is 70% among blacks. That is unprecedented in our history. Now, it's not just a matter of a racial thing. In Sweden, it is the mother of the welfare state, and illegitimacy in Sweden is 54%.
And why does a welfare state create illegitimacy?
Well, because, look, if you subsidize anything, you get losses of it, and if you tax something, you're going to get less of it. If you did not get welfare, then people would decide, I'm going to go out and get a job. I'm going to live more responsibly.
I'm going to get married before I have children.
That's right, yeah.
But the welfare state actually discouraged some men from marrying the woman.
Oh, yes.
She would lose the check.
That's right. The government has said to many young women, I am the father. Yeah, and so the father, black males have become dispensable.
Black illegitimacy was 19% in 1940, but it skyrocketed during the Great Society, and now it's over 70%.
Yeah, it's over, and that's a heck of a start in life. That is, to be born, you don't know who or where your father is. That's not really a great start in life.
All right, let's move on to licensing laws. Now, again, this is something that people tend to like, and outside this studio, just out there, are 10,000 yellow taxis. And it's intuitive to think that government should license those cabs, make sure they're safe, make sure the drivers are competent, limit the number of them so you don't have chaos out there. And they do license taxis here in New York. They license them to death. You can't just buy a cab and start picking up passengers. You have to buy a license from another cab company, and that now costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. Regulation itself has priced poor people out of the taxi business. And again, Dr. Williams saw that years ago.
I drove a cab back in 1957 for a while. I made about $125 a week. Drivers in Philly now tell me they make about $250 a week.
They could make much more if they owned their own cabs.
But what stops them? It's the thousands of federal and state regulations that are imposed on the U.S. economy. Sometimes getting a license requires a friend in the business. All those licensing laws do just one thing: keep outsiders out.
I mean, I can see when a medallion in New York now costs $600,000, it keeps poor people out. But are you saying just have no licensing, let anybody hang out a shingle, just go by, offer to pick people up? That frightens people.
Well, compare New York City, where a license to own and operate a taxi is $603,000 as of last year. Well, there are not many black-owned taxis in New York City. You go to Washington, D.C., and you see most of the taxis are owned by blacks. And so can you say, oh, well, there's Washington, D.C. is just a wonderful city for blacks. No, it takes $200 in order to get a license to own and operate one taxi, and that makes the difference.
The unintended consequences of well-intended regulation hurting the people that the politicians claim to be helping.
I don't think that they're unintended. That is, what incumbents want to do, they want to keep outsiders out so they can charge higher prices, and they make payoffs to politicians to keep the system in order.
Well, on that note, stick around because our audience wants, which is mostly students tonight, is going to ask you some questions and grill you about this. But next, another example of a business that helps minorities that government is trying to crush. Are you poor? You want to start your own business? Pull yourself out of poverty? Well, watch out, because government may not make it easy. Just ask this woman who's good at braiding hair. 10 years ago, she moved from Africa to Utah. She assumed she could support her 2 kids by using the hair braiding skills she learned in Africa. And she did for 4 years. Did this in her home and made decent money. But then the government shut her down because, as this video from the Institute for Justice explains, she didn't have an expensive and useless cosmetology license.
That license requires at least 2,000 hours of classroom instruction. That's 40 hours a week for 50 weeks. That is more class hours than it takes to be an armed security guard, mortgage loan originator, real estate sales agent, EMT, and lawyer combined. And not one of those 2,000 hours teaches African hair braiding.
Hair braider Justina Clayton joins us now from Utah, along with Paul Avalar, her lawyer from the Institute for Justice, which took her case for free. Paul, the license costs thousands of dollars for a class that's useless, really?
That's correct. In all those 2,000 hours, they don't spend any time teaching you how to braid.
So why do they pass a rule like that?
Well, what happened was the state just passed a really broad law and left it to the cosmetology board to interpret it and enforce it. And the cosmetology board is made up entirely of cosmetologists who don't like competition.
So they get to work with government to keep competition out. And Justina, you were doing this for 4 years, and then you think a competitor complained?
Yes, I actually got an email The email threatened to report me to the licensing division if I continue to braid.
But you'd already gone to the licensing commission, and they said, oh, hair braiding is okay.
Yes, but the cosmetology lady told me that the situation had changed and that I needed to go to school now and get a license.
Maybe the situation changed because your competitors complained. And the school really doesn't teach hair braiding, but you'd have to go anyway?
Yes, I called about 6 schools along the Wasatch Front, and they told me that they don't teach braiding and that I needed to, if I want to specialize in braiding, I would have to get independent help with that.
So they also told you if you want to work, you have to go to the legislature and get them to pass a law to allow you to do this. And you started to do that.
Yes.
They told you that if you kept braiding, went back into business, you'd be fined $2,000 a day?
Well, the first offense is $1,000. The second offense and any subsequent offense is $2,000.
So
each day.
Paul, I mean, this is nuts, and this is not unique to Utah, right?
It is not unique to Utah. There are about 10 states that explicitly require people to go get this expensive, useless license to braid hair. And about half of the states don't have a rule. They, like Utah, just leave it to the cosmetologist to decide whether or not they want to be competed with.
And states always create these licensing boards, and licensing sounds good to people. They don't realize they get captured by the established business.
Absolutely.
And when we called them, they said, we don't make the laws, we just enforce them. But you've gotten these laws overturned. You're 7 for 7 at the Institute for Justice.
That's right. We've
not overturned, but they give up when you call.
Yeah, that's right. In 7 states, we've sued about this very same issue. California fought us, and we beat them in court, and every other state and the District of Columbia has just given up the fight.
And Justina, one of the cosmetologists said, if you don't get a license and you don't go to school, braiding people's hair, you might make them bald.
No, braiding is, completely safe. It is reversible, so no, it doesn't hurt. It's not harmful.
But the government wants to stop you, and it used to be that 1 in 20 workers needed government permission to do their occupation. Today, it's 1 in 3. They keep passing more of these rules.
That's right, and occupational licensing laws fall hardest on minorities, on poor, on elderly workers who want to start a new career or change careers. They just help entrenched industries and businesses keep out competition.
Thank you, Paul Avelar of the Institute for Justice, and Justina Clayton. Good luck to you. I hope you can go back to braiding. Coming up is our show on the state against blacks continues a debate about whether minorities are unfairly targeted by police. Because the state is biased against blacks? That its rules encourage police officers to target blacks? Yes, says this former cop, Neil Franklin. No, says Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute. She says black prison rates are high simply because disproportionate numbers of blacks commit crimes. So, Heather?
The rate of homicide among black males ages 16 to 24 is 10 times higher than that of whites and Hispanics combined. The police are driven to certain neighborhoods not by race, but by crime data. Policing today is overwhelmingly data-driven, and it is victims' reports of crime that sends police to certain neighborhoods. The black crime rate is what it is. In New York City, to give you one example, the per capita shooting rate is 81 times higher in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, Brooklyn, which is predominantly black, than in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, which is white and Asian. Cops are going to be in Brownsville at much higher numbers because that's where people need police protection.
Neil, makes sense to me. That's where the crime is.
Well, a lot of that crime is on the foundation of our illegal drug trade.
And that's where we get to the topic of the show, the state against blacks. You say if we got rid of the drug war, this would change.
Absolutely. If you legalize drugs, put it in a regulated and controlled market, you take the profit out of it, then you take the violence out of it.
And Heather, what about that? Legalized drugs, all this racial disparity would diminish.
If we want to legalize drugs, that's a debate we should have on the merits, not because there's disparate impact on blacks. Every criminal law has disparate impact on blacks and on males. Nobody says we should get rid of homicide laws because the vast majority of murderers are males. And if you go to Harlem police precincts, what you're going to hear from those good citizens is we want the dealers off the corners, we want more cops, we want more arrests, and we want more stops.
But more arrests, Heather, what about the 50,000 plus that were arrested for marijuana possession last year in New York City? And 86% of those arrests were people of color, black and Latino. Explain that.
It's because...
And these aren't violent people. These were for marijuana possession. Simple possession.
They're
personal
not
use.
Yeah, but they're not going to prison for that.
They
They're
were
being
arrested.
stopped.
Do you know what an arrest does?
To your record, to
your record? It doesn't go away.
Okay, again, there's a question of free will. Nobody is forcing anybody to smoke or carry marijuana. But again, let's have that debate on the merits, not because of a disparate impact.
All right, well, you talk about the impact that is not the same with whites and blacks. Take the crack laws, which crack has traditionally been more used by blacks. 100-to-1 ratio in sentencing. 1 gram of crack is treated the same way as 100 grams of powder cocaine, mostly used by whites. I mean, that seems like the state against blacks, a racist law.
Is the state against white Appalachians? Because the meth penalty is exactly the same, and the percentage of black meth dealers is very low. The crack laws were driven by the sense of utter nightmare hell that was happening in inner cities. Charles Rangel, Major Owen of Brooklyn were leading the charge to try and increase the penalties against crack. This was not a racist conspiracy. If the Congress had not responded to the calls from the inner city to try and get a handle on this scourge, they would have been accused of racism. The bidding went out of control. There's no question. The 100-to-1, and we've changed that, was beyond what it needed to be. But it's not race. Again, the meth penalties are exactly the same, and that is predominantly a white and a Hispanic trade.
Our drug laws have been racist from the beginning, going back 40 years when Nixon implemented our so-called war on drugs, which was really a war on people. A war on black and brown people is what it was. Drugs are bad. I don't disagree with that. And I think that we should do a better job at teaching people to stay away from drugs. But here's the thing. Our policies sharply compounded the issue of drug use and abuse. It took it to another level, and it took it to that level of sending thousands upon thousands of black men to prison, most of which are for nonviolent drug offenses.
And it is true that beer hurts people too, and wine and cigarettes, but nobody's shooting up the neighborhood to get Marlboros. It's the law that raises the level of the crime that these politicians complain about.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's true, and you can make that argument against prohibition. But this is a very difficult issue, and if we legalize drugs, we're going to have more mothers who are unable to care for their children. If society wants this experiment, let's do it. But believe me, the police are not racist, prosecutors are not racist. There's been a whole industry of criminologists in law schools and in sociology departments that have been trying to find any evidence of racism in the criminal justice system for decades, and they can't.
Are you familiar with the New Jersey State Police in the 1980s and 1990s?
They were stopping cars on the turnpike.
On the New Jersey Turnpike. They would sit along the side of the road at night with their headlights shining across the road. And they would look for people driving cars who were black or brown, and then by sheer numbers, they would stop. If you stop enough cars, you're going to find drugs. But they weren't stopping white people.
John,
because drugs are illegal, and because the cops then have a way to get more arrests if they stop a lot of blacks?
Unjustly, yes.
John, it took a long time for somebody to do a speeding study on the New Jersey Turnpike. They finally did one, and they found out that blacks speed at twice the rate of whites on the turnpike. It's not even clear that at night on the highway that anybody can see the race of drivers.
You can.
So I am not.
I was
no,
a state trooper in Maryland for 20+ years, and yes, you can with your headlights across the road.
We won't solve this now, but Heather and Neil, please stick around because the audience gets to question both of you shortly. But next, I'll fight with a congressman who is a black activist and one of the biggest promoters of big government in America. Few people have been bigger supporters of big government helping everyone, but especially blacks, than Congressman Charlie Rangel. He's now in his 40th year in Congress, and when my colleague gave him a hard time recently about big government, the congressman said, "It's a great government. Why not be big?" So it's a great government. You spend almost twice the money that you have. Your welfare programs are unsustainable. Your tax laws are so complicated that even you who write them can't understand them. Government isn't great. Government is a bloated problem.
I cannot disagree with you more. It is the greatest idea of government since history has been recorded. And the standard of living for people, hey, I know poverty. I've seen it. We've had poor people burst out of poverty because of education, technology, and opportunity. And so...
But what's it have to do with big government and affirmative action and welfare?
Think all of these, well, listen, what do you want? No government?
No, I want it this size again. The Constitution and the Declaration. Great government right here. Big enough.
That government will throw me back in slavery. You don't want that. You don't want that government. Come on now.
I don't want to throw you back.
They weren't thinking about me when they wrote that book. I wasn't even 3/5 of a guy. So let's pass that book and say that it was a good beginning and it's there to improve on it, and that's what we've done.
All right, well, let's go beyond slavery to some of the many newer programs like affirmative action. Good?
You bet your life, even though there's some kind of a stigma attached to it that they're giving people priority or preferential treatment. The truth of the matter is, if you're in the land of the free where equality is there, and you find somebody with one leg, is it affirmative action to say, hey, if you got another leg hanging around there, attach it to this guy because we want to level the working field?
Walter Williams calls affirmative action despicable and mean. It's a mean practice to treat people differently just because they're members of one race or another.
Couldn't agree with him more. If you're treating them differently in a discriminatory manner, he and I read from the same page. If you affirmatively try to correct that type of conduct, I think it's the American thing to do.
But isn't it treating them differently if you have a lower score and you can get into college? If you're black and if you're Asian, you have to have a much higher score?
I would think so, but it has to be a balance.
All right, let's talk about another big government program. Welfare, AFTC, whatever, food stamps, whatever piece of it you want to call it. It's been a good thing for blacks?
I'm laughing because I'm a member of the Congressional Black Caucus and the founding members, and I tell my Southern white colleagues, we've done more for poor white folks than all of them together. Because
and
we
most
don't
recipients of welfare were white. That's true, have been white.
And it bothers me to see in our rural countries especially, they have not caught up with the rest of America. We don't single out black for welfare. And so therefore, any program that we have for people who are disadvantaged, there are just as many white people who are disadvantaged in this country.
But you mentioned
Medicare,
they haven't risen up. Maybe it's because of big government that they haven't. They've been taught to be dependent.
No, they've been taught to stand up on their own feet, and some people just need a little more help than others. You take the immigrants. We had to go out of our way to have them to learn English, to give them special programs. The Catholic Church was a haven for the Irish and Italians.
But the church was better than your big government. The church knew who needed help and who needed a kick in the rear. Clumsy, bloated government just gives it all to everybody.
Don't get me involved in churches. I'll put the government against them in a minute, because right now, somebody should be helping these people. Clearly, it's not the church advocating for them. And so
has welfare helped? Have these programs
you call it
helped?
Welfare, but if you have a child and you don't have any food for the child and medical care for the child, I don't care what you call it, John. The dignity of Americans, the dignity of our great country, is to see that no child dies, no child has malnutrition. I don't care what you call it, but the last stop should be the federal government. And I say the last stop.
Walter Williams says the welfare state did to black Americans what slavery could not do, what the harshest racism couldn't do. destroy the black family?
Well, I don't know Walter's background or connection with slavery.
Welfare encouraged men to move out of the house so that the child and the woman could get free stuff.
Do you believe that some man would leave his child because they wanted the mother to get a welfare check? I don't see how anyone
Yes, I think in
could
some
be.
cases the mother said, get out, or we can't get this money.
Well, listen, I've heard people do this. I heard Reagan talk about welfare people driving Cadillacs. But you have to have something a little more substantive if you're talking about welfare, if you're talking about big government. Are there areas that we should reform and change? You bet your life there are, but you can't just say welfare is bad and black folks have had their families destroyed because of it.
One more law meant to help people, the minimum wage. You've been a big supporter of raising it. That helps poor people?
You don't really think there should be a level of pay for services that are rendered by people?
A minimum level set by the state? No, I don't. I think the market should set it.
Well, how? We're right back to slavery, which I don't know. I guess I started this, but there was no minimum wage for slavery. Don't you believe there should be some bottom?
Well, slavery's forced. That's very different. A minimum wage? No. An employment contract.
Just assuming a hypothetical, you got a kid, he's 18 years old, he wants to work, and the guy says, well, I can't tell you what I'm going to pay you. I may give you $2 or $3 an hour. And
the kid can say no.
But if he needs a job, if he's trying to help out his parents, if he needs a...
But with the wage at $7.25, he doesn't even get offered the job.
The question, John, is the wage fair?
But how do you know $7.25 is fair? Why not 10? You're cheap. Why not $10? Why not $20 an hour?
Because economists try to find out what is fair in a general way. Is it perfect to pick a wage? But I can tell you this. The more disposable income that people have, it means that somebody is selling them goods or services. So putting money into people's hands that don't have it.
But how does it put money into the kid's hand if the employer...
By increasing the minimum wage.
But he doesn't get the job. The employer says, all right, then I'm not going to hire as many people.
But there's no statistics to prove that if some employer believes that the kid's not worth the minimum wage, guess what? He doesn't give him the job.
And that's why Walter Williams says that black unemployment is high because of your minimum wage law.
You know, I don't know Walter Williams personally, but if he's nearly as good as obviously you think he is because you rely on him, I'm taking him to Washington with me. You know,
well, on that
I don't know how
he is. Now, your questions for our guests. I'm joined by economist Walter Williams, who's taught me much of what I know, and also by Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute, and by ex-police officer Neil Franklin. So first, a question for Walter Williams from my Facebook page. Donovan Lukes says, what's the most pervasive economic myth in the U.S.?
Well, I think the most pervasive myth is that something can be had for nothing. That government can give one American $1 without first, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscate that dollar from some other American.
From the audience, yes? Go ahead.
I just want to say I agree with Mr. Williams. Welfare has become less of a government aid and more of an early retirement fund at the hands of taxpayers for regular people who get laid off.
I think one of the things that most Americans, I think it's a tragedy for our country, most Americans think that one American has the right to live at the expense of another American.
I think people believe the other Americans are people like me who have extra money, and it's only fair to take it from me and give it to somebody who's poor.
Well, I think, well, if I go outside of your studio, I can find some poor person out there, some hungry person, and walk up to you with a gun and say, John, give me your $200. Then having gotten your $200, I'll help that poor person out. Would you send me to jail?
Yes.
Yes. And so is there any difference when the government does it?
On that note, yes.
I feel like some of the black people, like black Americans, but they're given less chances. So I feel like that's why they're always resorting to like making the quick money.
By selling drugs, you mean?
Because it's a lot easier for them to do that instead of, you know, getting a job and being turned down every time. They have no other outlet to resort to.
Well, that's one of the reasons why our drug policies need to be changed. We need to move it into a regulated and legal market. When you have very few, if any, job opportunities in many of our urban neighborhoods, and these young people grow up in these neighborhoods and they see the #1 employer is the illegal drug trade, that's where they end up. It's the path of least resistance to get what they need to survive.
So if it weren't illegal, there wouldn't be all this money in it. Those people wouldn't make the quick buck. They'd live a smarter life.
And your neighborhoods would be a whole lot safer.
Heather, you disagree, obviously.
I understand the argument and I understand Neil's perspective, but I would say again that we're circumventing the issue of free will and self-control. And there are enormous numbers of young black males who are choosing to stay straight in the inner city. To say that they're somehow forced into the drug trade, I just think is wrong.
Another question from Facebook. Jared Graham says, wouldn't the end of government assistance cause violence?
Well, if you look, we've been a nation since 1787, and we did not have the welfare state until the 1930s, and only a tiny bit at that. And so you say, how in the world did we make it?
All right, but now people have gotten used to it. They feel entitled to it. You cut this out, people will riot in the streets.
No, I don't think so. I think that one point is missed in conversations like this, is that black Americans have made the greatest gains over the highest hurdles in the shortest period of time than any other racial group in the history of mankind. If you added up the amount of money that black Americans earn each year and thought of us as a nation with our own GDP, we would be the 18th richest nation in the world. Black Americans are some of the world's most famous people. It was one black American who was in charge of the world's mightiest military, namely Colin Powell. Now, in 1865, neither a slave nor a slave owner would have believed these kind of gains would be possible in just a little bit over a century. And as such, it speaks to the moral fortitude of a people, but just as important, it speaks to the greatness of a nation in which this kind of progress could occur. And why did it occur here? Well, we're not a perfect nation, but we are the freest nation, and we have been the nation with the least government interference.
Thank you, Walter Williams. Thank you, Heather McDonald. Thank you, Neil Franklin. When we return, evidence that minorities do better when government helps less, and my take on this. There's no question that in America, blacks, on average, are economically behind whites. Average black household income is about 40% less than for whites. Why? Other minorities were once that far behind, but they've prospered. In 1910, Chinese immigrants were 10% poorer than other Americans. Their grandkids in 1985 were 35% richer than other Americans. Other minorities rose out of poverty: Italians, Hungarians, the Irish, and so on. So why not most blacks? Because just at the time that blacks like Walter Williams were lifting themselves out of poverty, President Johnson created a government war on poverty. Trillions of your dollars were spent on welfare programs that unintentionally reward dependency. And then came more regulation, like licensing rules and minimum wage rules that stifle entrepreneurship. Politicians like Jesse Jackson say racism is why blacks still struggle today. But Walter Williams taught me that's just nonsense. There is still racism today, but if that's such an obstacle, explain the success of black immigrants in America. Their skin is just as dark, but they do well. They prosper. Immigrants from Jamaica are poorer than the average American. But a few years later, their kids are 1% richer than the average American. Why? Well, one reason is that it's harder for immigrants to get government assistance. They don't grow up in a culture of handouts, so they're forced to make it on their own. And that makes all the difference. What helps poor people most is limited government, simple rules that everyone understands, that leave newcomers free to braid hair, for example, or drive taxis or start companies. If the state keeps the peace but then gets out of our way, people prosper. I didn't understand that until Walter Williams taught me. And many Americans still don't get it. But while interviewing people in Times Square for this program, I was happy to hear that some people do get it. Like this man who said, no, there should not be a higher minimum wage.
If you raise the minimum wage, that basically means they're going to have to give a pink slip to someone else. So I don't think it helps.
Shouldn't there be a safety net?
When my parents came here in 1974, they were looking for opportunity. But I did grow up on public assistance, and it's hurt my mother more than helped her. To this day, I'm still trying to get her out of that welfare.
Well, how has it hurt her?
Well, you're not supposed to be making a certain amount of money, meaning say $22,000. My mother's never made over $22,000 in her life because she was afraid to lose her benefits. It's harmed her more than helped her. The individuals should pick up their own pants and do their thing, and if not, then I think there are some generous people who are willing to help.
There are plenty of generous people in America who want to help the truly needy, the helpless, and those charities do a better job of it than big government. I'd like to close this show by pointing out that one of my charities, one that teaches students about free markets, just held a What's Great About America essay contest. 8,000 high school students entered. One wrote that what makes America great is our diversity and our prosperity, our ability to go through the cruelty of Jim Crow South and still be committed to individual freedom. Well said, and Phil Wegman from Woodburn, Indiana, who wrote that, is here tonight. He won the contest. Congratulations. The runner-up, Dora Juhas, wrote about how her father came here from Hungary and learned that in America anything is possible. So congratulations to you too. Well, some things in America are impossible, actually, but in America, if government just stays out of the way, most things are possible. Wonderful things. And that's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching. Good night.